begun.
Next up, we have Powerslave, otherwise known as Exhumed in the PAL regions, a game that was released on the Sega Saturn in 1996. The game also saw a PS1 release in 1997 worldwide. It was also released on the PC in the same year that the Saturn version was released. However, that PC version compared to the console versions is different, which I'll talk about it later in this video. The game was developed by Lobotomy Software, who made the Saturn ports of Quake and Duke Nukem 3D, which they run under the Slave Driver engine that Lobotomy created for the console versions of Powerslave. Then, on February 10, 2022, the game saw a remastered release under the name Powerslave Exhumed, which combined the elements of the Saturn and the PS1 versions, and this version was developed by NightDive Studios, who are experts on remastering an old school game, and they are pretty solid to play, except this one. But then again, it wasn't NightDive Studios' fault, but rather Atari. I mean, they are not known for screwing a remastered version of a game, so I conclude that it was mostly Atari's fault. Anyways, today we'll see if Powerslave still holds up today, is as great as the other FPS games like Duke Nukem, Blood, or Shadow Warrior, or was this game outclassed by other great FPS games from that era? So, let's find out in this review. The plot of Powerslave is pretty simple. The city of Karnak has been invaded by some unknown forces of evil. A group of soldiers were sent to Karnak to uncover the source of this evil. Sadly, the helicopter is shot down by some unknown force and the player barely escapes. Then the player is sent into the valley and he finds the spirit of King Ramses, who tells him that Climate is going to resurrect Ramses and use its powers to, you guessed it, take over the world.
Of course!
And it's up to the player to stop the evil forces of Climate at any costs.
During the time of the pharaohs, the city of Karnak was a shining example of civilization that all other nations could only hope to emulate. Today, Karnak lives on, surrounded by the spirits of the past. However, something has gone terribly wrong. Unknown forces have seized the city, and great turmoil is spreading into neighboring lands. World leaders from all parts of the globe have sent forces into the Karnak Valley, but none have returned. The great power of this new empire is quickly crushing the best forces the human world has to offer. The only known information about this crisis came from a Karnak villager found wandering through the desert miles from his home, dazed, dehydrated, and close to death. In his final moments among the living, the villager told horrifying stories of fierce alien creatures that invaded the city, devoured the women and children, and made slaves of the men. Many of the unfortunate victims were skinned alive or brutally dismembered. Others were subjected to unbearable tortures, injected with strange substances, and then mummified while still alive. According to the villager, even the mummified body of the great King Ramses was unearthed and taken away. You have been chosen from a group of the best operatives in the world to infiltrate Karnak and destroy the threatening forces. But as your helicopter nears the Karnak Valley, it is shot down. You barely escape with your life. With no possible contact to the outside world, you begin your adventure, ready to accomplish your mission, praying to return alive.
At first glance, the gameplay of Powerslave seems very similar to other FPS games like Doom, Heretic, Blood, and Shadow Warrior. However, Powerslave is much more than just a run-in-the-mill FPS game. It's a hybrid of a FPS and a Metroidvania. You know, that genre where it's focused more on exploration and progression, and games like Castlevania Symphony of the Night really define the Metroidvania genre. Powerslave is pretty much like Symphony of the Night in terms of structure. You get new weapons, new power-ups along the way as you progress through the game, and you become much stronger than ever before. While I do think that Symphony of the Night is a great game, I find it a bit odd that Powerslave doesn't get enough credit for what it did. I mean, people say that Symphony of the Night was essentially the first Metroidvania game made. They don't know there was a Metroidvania game before Symphony of the Night was even a thing, and it was none other than Powerslave. Now granted, as a Metroidvania game, Powerslave is not as complex and refined as Symphony of the Night, but as a FPS game, it was pretty unique at the time. Rather than progressing level through level like you did in other FPS games like Duke Nukem 3D and Blood, you can revisit previous levels to find certain power-ups, new areas, and secrets, which other FPS games like Doom, Quake, and even Duke Nukem 3D couldn't do. As for weapons, Powerslave has some decent weapons, like the sword, which is good against small enemies like spiders and scorpions, and is also great for breaking fuzzes. The pistol is okay, decent against some of the weaker enemies in the game, but it's not very great against the bigger enemies in the game. The M60 is one of the weapons that you'll use a lot through the most of the game, and it's pretty easy to see why. I mean, its firing rate is good, it's excellent against most of the enemies in the game. Granted, the game doesn't have a shotgun, but the M60 makes it up for the lack of a shotgun. The ammo bomb works very similar to Blood's dynamites. You throw a bomb and it explodes upon contact. Simple as that. It's pretty good against most of the enemies, but the bombs also have another positive traits like destroying cracked walls, which once cracked, they reveal a lot of secrets, which is awesome. Lastly, you can learn the art of bomb boosting, which is pretty identical to Quake's rocket jumping, where you time your jump as the bomb detonates, propelling you higher than normal at the cost of some damage. The flamethrower is another useful weapon as it sets all the enemies on fire. The Cobra Staff is essentially an Egyptian version of the rocket launcher. It's powerful, but using it in close combat can cause immense damage to the player. The Ring of Ra basically fires a volley of fireballs that bounce around the vicinity, and finally we have the Manacle of Power, which is the BFG 9000 of the game. It fires bolts of lightning and annihilates every enemy on the screen, and it's pretty excellent against the bosses of the game. Every weapon in the game has an ammo bar. However, unlike in other FPS games where the ammunition is displayed by numbers, Powerslave does something different. The weapon's ammunition is displayed by a blue bar. You can replenish your ammo by picking blue orbs from monsters you kill, or via pickups hidden around the levels. Ammo will be restored to whatever weapon you have equipped when you pick up the orbs. Unlike in other games where there is different ammo sprites from each weapon, all the weapons have their own ammo bar, but they share the blue orbs, which can make conserving ammo pretty tactical. For instance, let's say that you have an M60 and a pistol, and the next area is filled to the brim with enemies. Both the weapons have no ammo, and there is ammo orbs to collect. Which weapon you want to recover? Do you want to use the orbs for the pistol, which will be unviable against the hordes of enemies, or do you want to use the orbs for the M60, which will evaporate the enemies in a flash? I think by now you know the answer. Then you have the power-ups, which in true Metroidvania's fashion are pretty vital to your journey. Power-ups like the Selbek mask, which allows you to breathe far longer whilst underwater, allowing you to reach underwater areas that were impossible without the mask. The protective anklet, which reduces damage taken from lava and poison swabs, the climax sector allows you to pass through climate energy force fields, and the Horus feather, which grants you the ability to levitate, assisting with crossing great distances. As you progress through the game, you will come across these golden and red anks. These will increase your maximum life, represented by an additional circle below your health bar. These anks are pretty important, trust me on this, because you're going to need all the health you can get to survive. In addition to the power-ups and the anks, you will need to pick up transmitter pieces, as they are required to get the good ending. Yes, you heard that right, Powerslave has a good and a bad ending. Not getting all the transmitter pieces will grant you the bad ending, in which the player gets buried in the Tomb of Ramses and gets excavated centuries later by the forces of the climate. Now, getting the transmitter pieces is not that hard, since they can be identified by a beeping noise heard on the overworld screen as well as playing the level itself, meaning that if you hear this sound, That means that the piece is there, so good luck with that. Then you have the Lobotomy team dolls, which can be found in every level of the game, so happy hunting. The enemies in Powerslave are pretty dangerous if you don't know what you're doing, and while some of the early game enemies are pretty weak, the late game enemies are no pushovers whatsoever. You have the spiders and the scorpions, who are easy to defeat with a sword or a pistol. The Anubis zombie, which is basically the imp from Doom, but with an Egyptian skin on it, all it does is firing fireballs at you, so keep your distance and quote-unquote dodge these fireballs. The birds are not much of a threat, the wasps are annoying, not as annoying as the hornets from Shadow Warrior in terms of raw power, but still very annoying to deal with in this game. And also, you can't have an Egyptian FPS game without the mummies. These donkeys can fire homing snake missiles, which can be very hard to dodge, just like another spooky enemy from a certain iconic FPS game that we all know and love. Then we have the Basets. These Pinkies wannabes are pretty dangerous since their claw attack deals heavy damage to the player, so never stop moving if you're facing these jerks. Oh, did I mention that they can teleport and ambushing you from behind? Because of course they can. And last but not least, we have the Magmenes. You know, that monster that appears in the cover of the game, and when you saw that monster for the first time, you knew that you're not dealing with the average Egyptian enemy, you were facing a fucking monster. When I first encountered him, it gave me the creeps. This demonic motherfucker shoots a barrage of fireballs, which deals a lot of damage, forcing you to take cover. Also, remember the old saying, shoot it until it dies? Well, the Magmenes functions quite different. Here is shoot it until it fucks off like a fucking pussy.
Fuck this shit, I'm out.
Not to mention that sometimes he can hide around the lava pool, so shoot it while you can. It's a terrifying monster to deal with, trust me on this. The bosses in Powerslave are honestly a letdown in my opinion. I mean, they're too easy. Sure, it's only 3 bosses, but even so, they are very weak. I mean, even Chernobog, one of the weakest boss of any old school FPS game, was far stronger than these losers. Having said that, the second boss was a bit challenging if you don't have enough ammo, so at least there's that. The third boss though, it was not very challenging in my opinion. Which brings us to the difficulty of this game. As a whole, Powerslave compared to the other FPS games in terms of difficulty is not that hard, but it's not that easy either. It's more in the middle if you're playing it on the normal difficulty. You see, the original Powerslave, the Saturn version that is, only had one difficulty mode. The NightDive version goes on an extra mile by adding a harder difficulty mode, which is for the players who have beaten Powerslave on the normal difficulty. So you might be asking, does the hard mode add anything new? Well, it adds more enemies, you take more damage from the enemies, and the enemies move much faster than ever before. This makes the game's experience much more challenging and great. Like I said, I found the game to be pretty easy on the normal difficulty, but when I played on hard, it was something else. Not as hard as Blood and Shadow Warrior, but just hard enough to be challenging. I had plenty of deaths, especially on the later areas of the game, where the game goes full ham on the player, and if you die, then say with me kids, it's probably mostly your fault. As far as level design goes, Powerslave strikes a positive Egyptian vibe, for the most part. There are some levels that are meh, while others are really well designed, especially the last stages, which they were a change of pace when it came to aesthetics. I like the lightning, the aesthetics, the shadows, you name it. They feel very Egyptian, to put it lightly, and I love it because what other FPS game does take place in Egypt? By Metroidvania standards, the levels does a great job at offering the player more exploration than any other FPS game released at the time, which makes the levels from Powerslave pretty unique compared to the levels of Duke Nukem 3D for instance, as the levels were totally designed with exploration and backtracking in mind. Rather than having a level where you slaughter hordes of enemies, the developers decided to create levels with Metroidvania elements, which as a result, the levels themselves are very non-linear. Having said that, does the game have flaws? Well, yeah. One of my complaints of the game is that the player's hitbox is too wide compared to the other FPS games that I played, which makes it pretty almost impossible to dodge projectiles on tight corridors. Having said that, did that flaw completely ruin my experience with the game? Not really. I got used to it after a while. And also, the sunken palace of Gnum. Jesus God! Good lord, fuck this level. On the surface, it looks like any other water level that you saw in other games, like Duke 3D's Toxic Dump, but however, unlike in that level where you can still use your weapons while you're underwater, in Powerslave, you can't do that, making this level very tedious to complete. Granted, you can use the grenades to detonate the bombs, but the bombs deal so much damage, not to mention that the piranhas can be very dangerous in this level. I died in this level 15 times, and it was pretty tedious, man. It makes Sonic's Labyrinth Zone look like child's play by comparison. I'm dead serious. On February 10, 2022, NightDive released the remastered version of Powerslave for PC, PS4, Switch, and Xbox One. Unlike the original version, which ran under the Slave engine, the remastered version runs under the Kex engine, which was used in many remastered versions of many FPS games like Turok, Quake, Blood Fresh Supply, and even Doom 64. And how accurate was the NightDive version actually? Well, at least in my opinion, it's pretty accurate to the original, and it goes even further beyond than just being accurate to the original version of the game. It actually combines many elements from the PS1, Saturn, and even the DOS versions of the game, with some new additions like the keyboard and mouse support, higher resolution support, and even CRT shaders, so that's pretty neat. Speaking of keyboard and mouse, does the game control better with a mouse and keyboard? Well, it's 69 times better than using a controller. Playing the game with a controller was a tedious chore in my opinion. I mean, playing any FPS game with a controller is a pain in the ass, as it limits your camera movement and reflex skills. But that's just me, I can't speak for everyone else. Back in the 90s, while Powerslave was running under the Slave engine on the PS1 and the Saturn, things were going different in the PC. Instead of porting the console versions to the PC, they decided to create the game using the build engine, which was used by many FPS games like Duke 3D, Blood, and Shadow Warrior. The results were very different. The levels from the PC version were much more linear, and it plays much like a typical FPS game than a Metroidvania game. So, what do I think about this version? Well, sadly I don't own the MS-DOS version of Powerslave, so I can't really form an opinion about this topic, but I've heard that this version, as far as build engine games go, it's mostly okay. Not as awful as they say, like Tech War, but not great either. It's just okay. Like I said, I've never played this version, so maybe in the near future I might pick this one up and talk about it in the future. For a Saturn game that was released in 1996, Powerslave looks incredibly gorgeous, and it showed what the Sega Saturn could really do when it was handled by a talented team who knew how to develop games on the Saturn. We know that the Saturn was very janky when it came to 3D graphics, compared to the PS1, which was pretty good at handling 3D graphics. That's not to say that the Saturn was an awful console. It had a lot of impressive 3D games like Panzer Dragoon, Quake, Virtua Fighter 2, and who could forget Sega Rally Championship. What I'm trying to say is that the Saturn can do amazing shit. It's just that the Saturn was a very difficult console to develop games on. It was basically the PlayStation 3 of its time. But back to Powerslave. As I mentioned before, it looked pretty good for a Saturn title, and it looks even better on the NightDive version, as it supports higher resolutions, higher frame rates, and anti-aliasing. It doesn't stop there though. The soundtrack of Powerslave is pretty amazing. It does an excellent job capturing this Egyptian feeling that you're in this haunting and exciting adventure. The music packs a lot of adrenaline, tension, and gloom, which is actually pretty dope. Here, have a load of this. The sound effects are pretty fine for the most part. The weapons sound effects are pretty good to hear, and they are pretty impactful. The enemy sounds are fine, so there's not much else to talk about it. Oh, how can I forget? The narrator's voice is pretty good, voiced by Don LaFontaine, who is a talented voice actor who did a lot of voice acting in film trailers, TV advertisements, and even game trailers. And I gotta say that he did an amazing job as not only as the narrator of the game, but also as King Ramses.
The gods are pleased that you have collected all of the 6 artifacts, but the pursuit for peace is not over. Seek out my corpse and return it to this tomb. But be warned, the Queen of the Kilmot Empire is furious with your doings and will tear your body to pieces unless you are properly armed.
At the end of the day, the graphics and sounds do the game justice and then some. Powerslave is an interesting FPS game. Instead of being a Doom clone with an Egyptian skin attached to it, it does something that other FPS games didn't do, and that was incorporating a lot of Super Metroid elements in an FPS game, which makes the only FPS game, as far as I know, that is an FPS game with a Metroidvania elements, and that was before Symphony of the Night was even a thing. And if I'm being honest, Powerslave should definitely deserve some praise and recognition for being one of the very first Metroidvania games ever made. And yes, I know Symphony of the Night redefined the Metroidvania genre, and Powerslave's mechanics are kinda basic, but for one of the earlier Metroidvania games ever made, Powerslave is not too shabby and did the job quite well. While some of the flaws, such as the player's hitbox being too wide to dodge the projectiles, kinda makes the game holding back from being perfect, the positives outweigh the cons. The gameplay is pretty solid, the graphics and the soundtrack are pretty top notch, showcasing what the Sega Saturn could do in spite of its janky architecture. If you're willing to play this game, the remastered version costs around 17 euros, which is a great price to pay. It's worth it, you won't be disappointed. At the end of the day, Powerslave is one of the most unique FPS classics ever made. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you like this review, be sure to hit the like button and hit the subscribe button for more content. And in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about Powerslave? Is it good? Do you think it should have some improvements? Whatever it is, let me know in the comments below. And that's all folks, see you guys next time!